This is the second video on the second chapter of John Dewey's Liberalism and Social Action. In video 1, I made the point that for Dewey, earlier liberals had provided principles in the form of rights that had helped bring down the feudal order, and he thought that fostered human progress. Yet the fact that early liberalism was based on principles proved to be its downfall in the end. This is Dewey's lodestar. The founders' idea that there were principles in politics or eternal truths in politics meant that sometime those principles would get in the way of adequate social organization. There might come a time when those principles would be outmoded, or when they would get in the way for constructive purposes. This was the problem with the first principles of the American founding as Dewey saw it. They were getting in the way of social organization. So what Dewey sets out to do in the second part of the chapter, which is really the bulk of the chapter, is redefine the central early concepts of liberalism: liberty, individuality, and intelligence. He tries to show that what they originally meant, why their meaning is outmoded, and what the new meaning of those concepts would be for constructive liberalism. We look at these three concepts in this video. Dewey begins this portion of the chapter with the following words. The demand for a form of social organization that should include economic activities, but yet convert them into servants for the development of higher capacities of individuals, is one that earlier liberalism did not meet. If we strip its creed from adventitious elements, there are, however, enduring values for which early liberalism stood. These values are liberty, the development of the inherent capacities of individuals made possible through liberty, and the central role of free intelligence and inquiry, discussion, and expression. What are adventitious elements? Adventitious means non-essential, or accidentally added. Dewey will strip liberty, individuality, and intelligence of their adventitious elements. They're elements that only held true in the conditions of early liberalism. And then he will reveal the essential character of these concepts. In a way, there are ideas or truths behind those earlier conceptions of liberty, individuality, and intelligence that Dewey seems equipped to reveal. This is the pattern of the second section of Liberalism and Social Action, Chapter 2. First, Dewey discusses liberty in paragraphs 6 through 13. The idea of liberty in earlier liberalism seems to have had two dimensions in Dewey's view. First, Dewey places the early liberal idea of liberty in opposition to the early liberal conception of government. Dewey does not emphasize this problem, though it is present in his description of the earlier doctrine of natural rights superior to legislative action. End quote. As Dewey sees it, natural rights constitute an absolute check on government and an absolute standard to which governments can be held. This is a problem for Dewey, because it seems to suggest that there are certain things that government can never do. Moreover, it suggests at some level an antagonism between individual liberty and governmental power. This idea Dewey considers untrue to the human condition and hence very dangerous. The second aspect of earlier liberalism's understanding of liberty to which Dewey objects is what he takes to be its economic character, its connection with what he calls laissez-faire economics. Once again, as Dewey sees it, early liberals believed that progress could be achieved only through a competitive free market. Hear Dewey from Chapter 7. Advocates of early liberalism held that beneficial social change can come about in only one way: the way of private economic enterprise, socially undirected, based upon and resulting in the sanctity of private property, that is to say, freedom from social control. So today, those who profess the earlier type of liberalism ascribe to this one factor all social betterment that has occurred, such as the increase in productivity and improved standards of living. The liberals do not try to prevent change, but they did try to limit its course to a single channel and to immobilize that channel." End quote. These early liberals believed, quote, "the regime of economic liberty would almost automatically direct production through competition into channels that would provide, as effectively as possible, socially needed commodities and services." They believed, in short, in the adequacy of the free market. Dewey believes that circumstances have rendered this early liberal economic conception of liberty obsolete and dangerous. People have used economic freedom, in his view, not only to mass great wells for themselves, but also to put their economic enterprises beyond what he regards as salutary social control. Industries underpay their workers, putting them in a condition of servitude and poverty and desperation. These early liberals overlooked, quote, "the fact that in many cases personal profit can be better served by maintaining artificial scarcity and by what Veblen called systematic sabotage of production. Above all, in identifying the extension of liberty in all its modes with the extension of their particular brand of economic liberty, they completely failed to anticipate the bearing of private control of the means of production and distribution upon the effective liberty of the masses in industry as well as in cultural goods. An era of power possessed by the few took the place of the era of liberty for all, envisaged by the liberals of the early 19th century." End quote. The powerful few have used the old idea of freedom, the idea that liberty stands above government, that is, to put their wealth and property beyond the reach of social control. These changes in circumstances point to the need for greater social control of economic forces. The old liberalism promised only purely formal or legal liberty, and capitalists exploited this legal liberty and turned it into exploitation, dependence, and a modern form of industrial tyranny. Here Dewey, quote, "social control of economic forces is necessary if anything approaching economic equality and liberty is to be realized. No longer private control, but rather social control will promote liberty. Investing government with power to control formerly private institutions actually promotes individual liberty, as Dewey sees it. The old idea of liberty and the new idea of liberty share a commitment to progress. The new liberty, however, sees itself as open to more ways in which progress can happen. The new liberty is consistent with and dependent upon government exercising social control over what was formerly thought to be individual freedom." The second concept that Dewey deconstructs is individuality, in paragraphs 14 and 15. Dewey's idea here is that the old version of liberalism assumed, for the purposes of public philosophy, that the individual was given, or assumed, to have full exercise of his rights. Quote, "The underlying philosophy and psychology of earlier liberalism led to the conception of individuality as something ready-made, already possessed, needing only the removal of certain legal restrictions to come into full play." End quote. Early liberals didn't see that individuality depended on social circumstances. That is, in a superficial form, a completely ridiculous statement and untrue to Locke and the American founders. All were concerned with the kinds of religion practiced, or the shape of family life, or the willingness of individuals to receive education. Dewey and the progressives didn't discover the importance of social conditions for individual development. And it is also incorrect to say that these early liberals thought that merely removing legal restrictions would bring proper institutions into existence. They thought those institutions had to be shaped. On a deeper level, however, Dewey's argument makes a deeper kind of sense. The early liberals thought families, churches, and other character-shaping institutions were private, beyond the direct control of government or social planners. This put early liberals in an awkward position, one that Dewey diagnoses and tries to remedy. Here is the awkward position. Consider a statement from John Adams. He writes, "The foundations of national morality must be laid in private families." Adams also believes that no republic or self-governing people can survive in the long haul without proper character or proper morality. So, in his view, the public depends on the private. The health and survival of the republic depends on the way private families do their business. This is what worries Dewey. He worries that the early liberals failed to complete the circle, to empower governmental institutions with sufficient power to guarantee their own survival. He would, essentially, make sure that governments are empowered to create the conditions for individuality, or to control all of the social conditions that might affect an individual's growth or development. Earlier liberalism put that control of social conditions mostly beyond the reach of government, and accepted that individuals as they came from private institutions. The new liberalism would expand its reach to control those formerly private institutions so that they would lend themselves to the cultivation of personal growth or development. Early liberalism knew that individuals were shaped by institutions, but didn't seek to control those institutions. The new liberalism would. Dewey writes as follows, quote, "Liberalism that takes its profession of the importance of individuality with sincerity must be deeply concerned about the structure of human association, for human association operates to affect negatively and positively the development of individuals." End quote. Whatever affects an individual's potential for growth or development is, in principle, under the purview of government, because all those aspects have a bearing on the public and its promise, and all affect an individual's destiny. Public education must, in some sense, begin earlier and displace the family, and work its effects in creating the conditions for each individual to grow and develop. Therefore, Dewey was interested in public education. Private religion must not shape people apart from public values. Hence Dewey's interest in reestablishing religion as a common faith, or the progressive tendency to define the gospel in terms of social needs. Both these redefinitions of early liberalism assume that a new kind of science exists. The progressive definition of liberty assumes that there is a science out there that knows how to regulate economic interests so as to promote the general well-being, a science that knows how to allocate society's goods and arrive at the proper price and supply of things better than the market. The progressive definition of individuality assumes that someone knows how to arrange social institutions so as to promote an individual's growth and development. This new kind of knowledge, progressivism makes possible. Dewey calls this new knowledge intelligence, the third concept that he sees progressivism progressing beyond the ideas of early liberalism. The section on intelligence begins in paragraph 16 and goes till the end of the chapter, paragraph 30. It is fully half the chapter. Earlier forms of liberalism believed in intellectual progress, but they believed that the processes that give individuals progress were something akin to a marketplace of ideas, with an emphasis on deliberation and dialogue. Dewey gives, quote, grateful recognition, end quote, to early liberals, quote, for their valiant battle in behalf of freedom of thought, conscience, expression, and communication, end quote. This defense of freedom was essential to freeing the human mind from the superstition, monkish ignorance, doctrines of religious faith, traditions, and other irrational dogmas under which the human mind had for too long slumbered. These early liberal doctrines were political doctrines, however, and not in the strict sense true. Dewey could not be clearer on this. The early liberal concept of knowledge was, quote, a political weapon devised in the interest of breaking down the rigidity of dogmas and of institutions that had lost their relevancy. Their doctrines were potent in exposure of abuses. Yet these open-ended doctrines had two significant problems. First, they did not set up an incontrovertible set of conclusions that could be used to build social truths. Because these early liberals protected the rights of individuals to conduct inquiries, they allowed individuals the right to live in light of their errors. Error had the same status as scientific truth. In the marketplace, if it could win a hearing. Second, knowledge does not come from individuals, but rather from a collective, progressive enterprise, wherein those trained in the proper methods of inquiry and experimental methods participate with fellow knowers in scientific experiments until we know how action can and should be guided. Early liberalism destroyed institutions that could be in the way of scientific knowledge, but the early liberal doctrines of freedom of mind now get in the way of the collective scientific enterprise. One can almost see frustration in Dewey's writings. He asks, in effect, why don't the people listen to the sound science on which I base my recommendations? What does this new science allow the progressives to do? Here, Dewey could not be clearer. Intentional social planning. This will be especially true of the two fields where intelligence might be supposed to be most alert and most continuously active: education and the formation of social policies in legislation, end quote. Social policies will not come only in the form of legislation, but also, and mainly, through organized social intelligence, and will lead to the conduct of public affairs through legislation and administration. Science, more than the consent of the governed, or not just the consent of the governed, will determine the direction of public policy. Science will shape the social conditions, leading to the development of a genuine individuality. So we have the recipe for a new liberalism. Science must be publicly empowered to shape the conditions for the development of individuality. Scientists must regulate the industries to make the enjoyment of liberty more effective instead of being just a formal thing. Here is what science has taught, for instance. Early liberalism thought it was okay for individuals to feel insecure because that insecurity was a goad to work. Worries about the future would lead to better and more productive labor and perhaps to virtue. Science reveals, however, that now insecurity leads to despair, hopelessness, and suicide. Material security is the prerequisite for the enjoyment of liberty now. This development is just one of many that have happened and will happen. Quote, "There are always new forces coming in and new needs arising that demand, if new forces are to operate and new needs to be satisfied, a reconstruction of the patterns of old experience." End quote. This work of reconstruction will be done by scientists informed by organized social intelligence, empowered through progressive legislation and administration. This work of reconstruction is what Dewey calls, in the final chapter of this book, renascent liberalism. There he sees this intelligence as leading to organization of intelligent action, or as admitting in systematic origination of comprehensive plans. What does this look like in practice? Research universities leading governmental administrators in the creation of a better world, one guided by sound science. Or so Dewey seems to think.